The year was 284 CE, and Rome was teetering on the edge of collapse. After decades of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, the once mighty empire had been ravaged by civil wars, economic depression, and barbarian invasions. In just 50 years, more than 20 men had claimed the imperial throne, most dying violent deaths shortly after. Into this chaos stepped Diocletian, a military commander of humble birth from Dalmatia. Through strategic brilliance and political acumen, he secured power and embarked on one of history's most ambitious governmental restructurings. His story, and the cautionary tales of many leaders who followed, reveals timeless lessons about what one should never do after gaining political power. On November 20, 284 CE, following the mysterious death of Emperor Numerian, the army proclaimed Diocletian as the new emperor. His first act demonstrated both his ruthlessness and political savvy. When Numerian's father-in-law, Arrius Aper, was accused of the murder, Diocletian personally executed him before the assembled troops. As the historian Aurelius Victor records, Diocletian declared, "Boast no more, Aper, for it is by my hand that the wild boar has died," fulfilling a prophecy that had predicted Diocletian would become emperor after killing a boar, Aper in Latin. This decisive action consolidated his initial power, but Diocletian recognized that maintaining control over the vast Roman Empire required more than dramatic gestures. Unlike many before him who had clung jealously to absolute power, Diocletian made the revolutionary decision to share his authority. In 286 CE, he appointed his trusted general Maximian as co-emperor to rule the western provinces while he managed the east. Later, in 293 CE, he expanded this system into what became known as the Tetrarchy, ruled by four, by appointing two junior emperors, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus. This power-sharing arrangement provided more effective governance across the sprawling empire and helped end the cycle of military coups that had plagued Rome. But what makes Diocletian's story truly remarkable is that in 305 CE, after 21 years of rule, he did the unthinkable for a Roman emperor. He voluntarily abdicated and retired to his palace in Split, in modern-day Croatia. He even convinced Maximian to do the same, though his colleague did so reluctantly. The historian Flavius Caradus, who studied this period extensively, notes that Diocletian's willingness to relinquish power stands in stark contrast to the behavior of most rulers throughout history. When asked to return to politics during a later crisis, Flavius writes, Diocletian famously replied that he was too busy growing cabbages in his garden to consider returning to power. Yet despite Diocletian's orderly succession plan, the tetrarchic system collapsed almost immediately after his retirement. Civil wars erupted as ambitious men, including Maximian, who came out of retirement, and his son Maxentius, fought for supreme power. This brings us to our first warning from history: never assume your carefully designed systems will survive without you. The collapse of Diocletian's system leads us to perhaps the most notorious example of what not to do after gaining power, the reign of Emperor Nero, who ruled Rome from 54 to 68 CE. Initially, Nero seemed promising. Guided by his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, his early rule was characterized by moderate policies and sound governance. But as the historian Tacitus records, once Nero felt secure in his position, his behavior changed dramatically. After the death of Burrus in 62 CE and the retirement of Seneca, Nero abandoned the council of wise advisors, a critical mistake for any leader. He had his mother Agrippina murdered in 59 CE, eliminated potential rivals, and indulged in increasingly extravagant and bizarre behavior. During the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which destroyed much of the city, Nero was rumored to have fiddled while Rome burned. While this specific detail is likely apocryphal, the violin did not exist in ancient Rome. Tacitus and Suetonius record that Nero was indeed absent during the initial disaster, returning only to exploit the cleared land to build his massive Golden House complex. Perhaps most fatally, Nero alienated the very power bases needed to maintain his rule. He antagonized the Senate, lost the support of the military, and exhausted the treasury with his lavish spending. When rebellion broke out in 68 CE, he found himself isolated and abandoned. Facing imminent capture, he committed suicide, reportedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." The second warning from history is thus revealed: never alienate those who put you in power or those who support you need to govern effectively. A similar cautionary tale emerges from 16th century England. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his 9-year-old son Edward VI became king. Real power, however, fell to Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, who quickly secured appointment as Lord Protector of the realm and Duke of Somerset. Somerset's initial position was strong, but his handling of power offers another lesson in what not to do after achieving political authority. According to contemporary accounts, he made the critical error of simultaneously alienating both the common people and his fellow nobles. His aggressive religious reforms advancing Protestantism created social unrest, while his attempts to address economic inequality through land reform threatened aristocratic interests. Meanwhile, he built himself a grand London residence, Somerset House, by demolishing church properties during a time of economic hardship for many. Perhaps most fatally, Somerset failed to secure his political base against rivals. By 1549, just 2 years after gaining power, his own brother Thomas had plotted against him and was executed. Then in October 1549, a coalition of nobles led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, later Duke of Northumberland, outmaneuvered Somerset and removed him from office. Somerset's story demonstrates another critical error: never pursue ideological agendas at the expense of political stability, especially before consolidating power. Turning to the classical world again, few failures of leadership are as instructive as that of Demetrius I of Macedon, known as Poliorcetes, the besieger. Born in 337 BCE, Demetrius was the son of Antigonus I Monophthalmus, one of Alexander the Great's generals who carved out territory after Alexander's death. Demetrius gained initial fame for his military innovations, including the construction of massive siege engines like the Helepolis, Cititaca, a 9-story wheeled tower used in his famous siege of Rhodes in 305 to 304 BCE. Though he failed to take Rhodes, his ingenuity and daring made him a celebrated figure. In 294 BCE, Demetrius captured Athens and then seized the Macedonian throne. But his subsequent actions reveal another fatal mistake of new rulers: never neglect the basics of governance while pursuing grandiose ambitions. According to the biographer Plutarch, Demetrius adopted the trappings of Eastern monarchy, wearing elaborate purple robes and a double diadem. He became inaccessible to his subjects, forcing petitioners to wait months for audiences. When Macedonians submitted written requests, he dramatically dumped them into a river while passing over a bridge. Most fatally, Demetrius began preparations for an extraordinarily ambitious campaign to reconquer Alexander's entire empire, a plan requiring massive taxation and military mobilization from populations already exhausted by decades of warfare. His subjects, both Greek and Macedonian, soon rebelled against these demands. In 288 BCE, just 6 years after gaining the Macedonian throne, Demetrius faced a coalition of enemies, including Pyrrhus of Epirus and Lysimachus of Thrace. Abandoned by his troops, he eventually surrendered to Seleucus I in Syria in 285 BCE and died in captivity 3 years later. The lesson is clear: never lose touch with your subjects' capacity and willingness to support your ambitions. One of history's most instructive examples of what not to do after gaining power comes from Imperial China during the short-lived Sui dynasty, 581 to 618 CE. When Emperor Yang of Sui succeeded his father in 604 CE, he inherited a newly unified China with substantial military strength and economic resources. Yang initially showed promise as an administrator. He completed the Grand Canal linking northern and southern China, a monumental engineering achievement that remained the world's longest artificial waterway for centuries. He reformed the examination system for selecting officials and codified the legal system. However, Emperor Yang made catastrophic miscalculations that destroyed both his dynasty and himself. After consolidating power, he launched a series of military campaigns against Goguryeo, in modern Korea, that depleted the imperial treasury and exhausted his population. The first campaign in 612 CE reportedly mobilized over 1 million troops, yet ended in disastrous defeat. Rather than reassessing his strategy, Yang launched 2 more failed invasions in 613 and 614 CE. As Chinese historical records attest, the conscription of millions of laborers for both the Grand Canal and these military campaigns created unprecedented hardship across the empire. Peasant rebellions erupted by 616 CE, and in 618 CE, Yang was assassinated by his own officials. The Tang dynasty that followed ruled China for nearly 3 centuries. Emperor Yang's folly reveals another critical lesson: never persist in costly failures due to pride or stubbornness. Moving forward in time to the 18th century, we find the cautionary example of Louis XVI of France, who ascended to the throne in 1774. Unlike some of our previous examples, Louis was not a cruel or particularly ambitious ruler. His downfall instead demonstrates the danger of indecisiveness after gaining power. When Louis became king at age 19, France faced serious financial problems. The nation's participation in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, had only worsened its fiscal crisis. Reform was desperately needed, but Louis failed to act decisively or consistently. He initially supported his finance minister, Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot, who proposed necessary but unpopular reforms to reduce court expenditures and modernize France's tax system. But when faced with opposition from privileged classes, Louis dismissed Turgot in 1776 rather than backing the reforms. This pattern repeated with subsequent ministers, including Jacques Necker and Charles-Alexandre de Calonne. Louis would approve reform proposals, then retreat when they met resistance. By 1789, the financial crisis had become unmanageable, forcing Louis to convene the Estates General for the first time since 1614. What followed, the tennis court oath, the storming of the Bastille, and eventually the full French Revolution, demonstrates the consequences of a leader who cannot commit to necessary action. Louis's vacillation continued through the revolutionary period, attempting to flee France in June 1791 but then accepting a constitutional monarchy only to be caught in secret communications with foreign powers. His execution in January 1793 stands as a stark reminder: never fail to address fundamental problems requiring difficult decisions. The psychological underpinnings of these leadership failures have been studied extensively by modern political scientists and historians. Dr. Livia Zenstrom, a leading expert in power dynamics at Oxford University, has identified what she calls post-ascension syndrome, a collection of cognitive biases that affect leaders shortly after they gain power. Power fundamentally alters how individuals process information and relate to others, Dr. Zenstrom explains. Brain imaging studies show that power activates the same reward pathways as addictive substances, while simultaneously reducing activity in areas associated with empathy and risk assessment. This neurological shift helps explain why so many leaders, regardless of era or culture, make similar mistakes after securing power. They become less receptive to contradictory information, more confident in their own judgment, and less able to accurately assess how others perceive them. Perhaps the most instructive modern example comes from the final years of the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he inherited a stagnant economy and a system resistant to change. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were bold attempts to reform the Soviet system while preserving its essential character. However, Gorbachev's approach revealed another critical error: never initiate reforms without fully understanding their potential consequences and preparing for them. By allowing greater freedom of expression without addressing fundamental economic problems, Gorbachev unleashed forces he could not control. Nationalist movements emerged across Soviet republics, while economic reforms created hardships without delivering immediate benefits. The failed coup attempt against him in August 1991 led to the very collapse he had sought to prevent. As historian Flavius Caradas observes, Gorbachev's tragedy was that he was right about the need for change but underestimated how quickly reforms would unleash suppressed forces within Soviet society. Once started, the process could not be controlled at the pace he envisioned. This brings us back to Diocletian, whose story began our exploration. Despite the ultimate failure of his tetrarchic system, his reforms profoundly transformed the Roman Empire. He reorganized provinces, reformed taxation, attempted to control inflation through price edicts, and created a more centralized bureaucracy that would evolve into the Byzantine Empire. Most significantly, his willingness to relinquish power voluntarily stands as a rare counterexample to the pathology of power that has afflicted so many leaders throughout history. From these historical cases, several clear lessons emerge about what one should never do after gaining political power: never assume your systems and plans will outlive your direct control, as Diocletian discovered when his carefully designed Tetrarchy collapsed after his retirement. Never alienate those who support you. Need to govern effectively, as Nero did with the Senate and military, ultimately leading to his downfall. Never pursue ideological agendas at the expense of political stability, as Edward Seymour learned when his ambitious reforms cost him his position and eventually his life. Never lose touch with your subjects' capabilities and needs, as Demetrius I did when his grandiose imperial ambitions exhausted his population's patience and resources. Never persist in costly failures due to pride, as Emperor Yang's repeated failed invasions of Korea demonstrated, destroying both his dynasty and himself. Never vacillate when fundamental problems require difficult decisions, as Louis XVI's indecisiveness regarding necessary financial reforms contributed to the French Revolution. Never initiate reforms without understanding their full potential consequences, as Gorbachev discovered when his well-intentioned changes accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse. These lessons transcend their historical contexts and remain relevant for contemporary leaders in business, politics, and other spheres. The psychological traps that ensnared rulers from ancient Rome to the modern era continue to affect decision-makers today. As we navigate our own complex world, the wisdom distilled from these historical examples offers guidance for those who achieve positions of influence. Power itself is neither good nor bad, it is a tool whose impact depends entirely on how it is wielded. The most successful leaders throughout history have been those who recognized its psychological pitfalls and consciously worked to counteract them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is also the simplest: power is better understood as a responsibility to be carried than a prize to be won. Those who forget this fundamental truth often find themselves added to the long list of cautionary tales that future generations will study.